Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou tātou katoa, nau mai, haere mai, ki te whare karakia nui I tēnei pō. Welcome, welcome. My name's Ben Truman. It's my joy and pleasure to be the Dean of the Cathedral here, and it's a particular delight to welcome you here this evening as we hear from Cole. A few housekeeping matters as we begin. Firstly, thank you so much for being here. It's a lovely testament to your care for things that are happening in our world that we ought to be passionate about. So thank you for being here. Secondly, to put you at ease, if you have parked in the car park out there or the grass, that is exactly what I hoped you would do, and that is wonderful. So you don't need to run away and move your car. If you would like to use the bathrooms at any stage during this evening, you'll find those in a separate cabin just out of those doors on your left and just sort of tucked in by the cathedral that way. Feel free to go out there. Just be careful if you're going out that door because there's a wee power cable that I don't want you to trip up on. Hopefully you have had something to eat and had something to drink. There will be a chance to do that at the end of Cole's presentation as well as a chance for questions and answers. You all look like wonderful, holy and good people. I presume that is the case. But I'm also aware that when we talk about politically charged things, we can have some, I'll be euphemistic, interesting questions and personalities. I am going to gracefully ask you to cut a question short if I don't think it's appropriate, and I will be asking you to leave if I think it's completely inappropriate. This needs to be a safe space for all those here. So hard questions, certainly, but offensive questions, no thank you. Also, please make them questions, not statements, but I'll be reminding you of that later on. Cole, it is a delight to welcome you here to Christchurch Cathedral. It is a delight to see the work that you are doing. It's been my pleasure to be following Cole for the 6 months that he was over in the West Bank and seeing some of the stories coming out. Cole, I think, for those of you who've had a chance to read some of his work or chat with him, is someone of immense integrity, immense passion, immense courage, and is a wonderful communicator. And so we're delighted to be able to host you here. We are live streaming the service, so if you would like to share with others after the fact or rewatch anything, please know that you can do that. Without further ado, please give a very warm welcome to Cole.
Thank you. I love getting an applause for standing somewhere, but no, lovely to join you all this evening, and just blown away by how many of you have turned out. It's really wonderful. So as Ben introduced me, my name's Cole. I'm an Ōtautahi local and an Anglican, so it's beautiful to be able to share in this space. We're going to jump into it. But before we do, I want to give a couple of disclaimers, or not disclaimers, just acknowledgements. One of which is just to acknowledge the land here and our history of this land being taken through many of the similar means that we'll kind of explore tonight from tangata whenua. Secondly is acknowledging what a privilege it was for me to spend a single day in Palestine. I have a number of friends now across Aotearoa and elsewhere in the world who are from that land but have never been able to even return or visit for many of them. So wanted to acknowledge the mamae, the pain of that for many of those communities. And then thirdly, I often will talk about some of these stories in quite a sterile way, just very factual, not too much emotion, and I just want to acknowledge that because these aren't just stories, they're people's lives. Many of them I'm fortunate to call friends, and they deserve more than just that kind of sterile telling, but just want to acknowledge that. Or it might go the other way, and we might have some tears, and that might be a lovely blessing. But yes, so I've just returned less than a month ago from 6 months on the ground living in the West Bank in occupied Palestine. I first visited back in 2019, and spent 2.5 months there last year. So I've kind of been seeing how things have continued to shift and change, and how Israel's occupation has continued to expand within that time. And as a photo video journalist, have been kind of documenting some of that. So as I say, we will jump on into it when I turn on my clicker. There we go. I want to start with some of the beautiful locations in Al-Quds, or Jerusalem, the holy city, a very sacred place for Jews, Christians and Muslims, with some beautiful scenes, these narrow roads up the Mount of Olives. This in the center here is the Resurrection Church, or the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, with a little house built over top of Jesus' empty tomb. For those fellow Christians in the room, a very special place, and the Garden of Gethsemane at the bottom of the Mount of Olives, where Jesus was arrested. So where Palestine is situated, it has had many different people groups and empires coming through, and so you've got this really rich mixing pot of history and religion. So it's an incredibly sacred place from that perspective. And as I say, historically, you have places like Batir, where you have these farming terraces that have existed for 3,000 years, which is pretty unbelievable. I got to document some wonderful religious holidays like Sabt al-Nur. This is kind of like, it's the pinnacle of the Eastern Orthodox Christian calendar. Thousands of Christians will gather around Jesus' tomb in the Church of Resurrection, and by tradition they light a candle inside the tomb, and then they hand it from torch to torch with this great excitement, and it spreads around the room. It looks dangerous, but it's very cool. And then they rush out onto the streets with energy, passing it again from torch to torch, and then they take it off and it crosses borders and checkpoints. Some of it gets taken on planes to Orthodox churches all around the world. This beautiful Christian tradition which has been going on for 1,400 years or longer. I also can't not mention the food, man. Beautiful freshly baked bread daily. You've got me eating looking very stoked, eating some muntz there in the middle. This is rice with meat that just, in this case, just like melted off the bone, and yogurt poured on top, celebrating the end of Eid al-Adha holiday. And then on the right here is my friend Wissam, a Palestinian Christian from Beit Zuhur near Bethlehem. He's cooking up some jarisha in his backyard. This is kind of like Palestinian stir fry. It's delicious. I was privileged to reconnect with old friends. This is my mate Ayman, who I first met when I first visited the land back in 2019. Eternally attached to his shisha, but just a lovely, lovely host. I got to meet his young boy, who's been born since I first visited. That's my bucket hat he's wearing. And I got to make new friends. This is Aja, who I met last year. She's part of the Palestinian climbing community, which I didn't even realize was a thing. And then when I did, it made a lot of sense because there's loads of rock. And so they meet every Friday and go climbing, and then have a big shared meal afterwards. This wonderful outdoors community. And families that I just met while standing on the side of the road. They kind of pulled up in their car, and they wound down the window, and I spoke no Arabic at that stage. They spoke no English, and so over Google Translate they said, "Hey, do you want to come release a snake with us?" And I said, "What?" And sure enough, they opened the boot, and there in this plastic jar, they have the snake that they caught in their house. And so I said, "Sure." And we went to the edge of town and released what turned out to be a very venomous snake back into the wild. And then they invited me back to their house for a cup of tea, which then became dinner, which then became an offer to stay the night. So just really generous hospitality, and I want to emphasize that because the generosity and kindness that I have found from Palestinian communities is I haven't found it matched anywhere else in the world. It's just wonderful and so deep and genuine. And many other wonderful friends and memories that I formed throughout my last 6 months there. And I share all of that because often that stuff kind of gets overlooked amongst the headlines. I was speaking in a school actually just this week, and I asked the kids, "What do you think when you hear Palestine?" And they listed things like war, destruction, bombs. But Palestine is so much more than that. There's so much depth and beauty to the land. But I also speak about those things because often, for anyone who's been to the land, has anyone been over to Palestine, Israel? A number of us, fantastic. So you likely will have encountered some of that, but I also want to now take us on this journey, which I'm sure is why many of you are here, kind of beyond the wall or beyond the pilgrimage trail, because often the political elements, the human elements get missed amongst the kind of tourist industry, because obviously there's a much darker side to the land as well. And just jumping back a slide, this here is Al-Aqsa Mosque, and behind that is the Western Wall, two incredibly sacred sites for Islam and Judaism. I also share those stories because I don't want to start with a geography lecture, but I think it really helps to understand the geography and the land, to understand some of these stories as we proceed. So this here, oh, I've got a laser pointer, I think. Look at that. So this whole area here in the middle is what we talk about when we talk about historic Palestine or the Levant. It's this wonderful region kind of centered between Africa, Asia, and Europe. So it's kind of been, as I say, a bridge for many different civilizations across thousands of years. It was on the Silk Road, and so you just have this mixing pot of people who have been coming and going and moving quite freely around that land up until 1948 with the creation of the modern-day state of Israel, which you can now see in white through the middle there, splitting off what remains of what we refer to as the occupied Palestinian territories, the Gaza Strip out on the Mediterranean coast there, and the West Bank, named the West Bank because it's on the western bank of the Jordan River. So when Israel was created, Zionist militia actually swept through many, many villages, and 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly expelled, ethnically cleansed from over 530 villages. And so many of them now live in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, in many refugee camps and around the world. And we have some wonderful members of our community here in Ōtautahi and across the Motu who are from Palestine. And so there were pockets of Palestinian autonomy within that, but since 1967, essentially all of this area came under Israeli control, different forms of military domination. So as I say, there's little pockets where Palestinians have a little more autonomy, but essentially Israel controls that whole land. And also just want to acknowledge up the top here, the Golan Heights, again, also that is land belonging to Syria that was taken in 1967 as well, and we'll delve into more of this as we continue. This is it for scale, over top of the South Island. So it's actually an incredibly small piece of land, around the size of Canterbury, I believe. And that means when we're talking about the Gaza Strip, where this genocide has been continuing for the last 2 years, we're talking about a piece of land roughly from Leithfield to Christchurch city centre at its longest point, 365 square kilometres. And it's had more bombs dropped on it in the last 2 years than the equivalent of around 6 nuclear bombs. I think that was actually the statistic around this time last year, so obviously it's even more now. So incredibly sobering. But the Gaza Strip is closed off to international journalists, and in fact over 250 journalists within Gaza have been killed by Israel, targeted over the last 2 years as well. So I was actually living here in the West Bank, in the wonderful town of Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus for any fellow Christians in the room. And I was living in Ida refugee camp. So Ida is a camp with these families who were displaced in 1948. And so, almost 8 decades later, they continue to live there, which is why it doesn't look like kind of the traditional image of a refugee camp, like a tent city. It very much began that way, but as time went on, those tents then became little tin sheds, and as the reality kicked in, those tin sheds became concrete buildings, which, as the families then grew, they needed to expand. And without the space to expand outwards, they've built up. And so what you have today are these very tall buildings, narrow streets, and very limited infrastructure because it hasn't been able to develop like a normal city suburb would. This is the view from my little apartment in Ida camp. Looking out across on the right-hand side there, the local cemetery. On the left-hand side, under the little Palestinian flag draped there, is the local community centre. And then we have in the background the wall, and just the other side of the wall in this particular location is an Israeli military base. And I want to draw your attention to the blue gate in the centre here. This gate, which was installed with the pure purpose of giving easy access from this military base directly into the refugee camp for these raids that happen all the time, where military will come in, they'll enter people's homes, abduct people from their homes, fire off live rounds, tear gas, rubber bullets. It happens all the time, including sometimes during the day. Kids like this guy on his bicycle might be hanging out the front of the community centre and have tear gas fired at them from this watchtower you see just on the right-hand side there. In fact, Ida Camp, a 2017 study found, is actually the most tear-gassed place in the world, a refugee camp. Just up the road a little further, this is the camp football field, and you can see what remains of some kind of netting that was once draped over the top. That wasn't to stop the ball from being kicked out, that was to stop tear gas from being fired in while children were playing football there. And in fact, they now have a pitch at the other end of the camp, which they speak about as the safe pitch, where you can play football without that risk. And actually, this photo here I took last year. This is Musa, or Muhammad Al-Assa. He runs the community centre here in the camp. And in fact, I was actually showing this photo around the country last year, and I met a lovely friend, Sayed, up in Nelson, and he said, "Oh, I'm from Ida Camp." I said, "No way, I visited." He said, "Show me your photos. I probably know some of the people." So I opened it up. This is the first photo. He goes, "Ah, that's my brother." So it's a wonderful reminder that this is not distant, this is very close to home. Muhammad in this photo is actually explaining to us how he was shot in the eye with a rubber bullet during one of these raids and is very lucky to be alive. Fortunately, it missed his brain. So it's an incredibly sobering photo in many ways, but for me it's also a photo of hope because this is actually a workshop that he's standing in, where they take all of these tear gas canisters and they cut them up and they turn them into beautiful little pieces of jewellery. Now I've just realised I've left it sitting in my van, but I have a beautiful little necklace made out of these aluminium tear gas canisters. So it's kind of this, the comparison of turning swords into ploughshares, taking these weapons created for harm and destruction and turning it into this thing of beauty. So when we talk about different forms of Palestinian creative non-violent resistance, this is one example of that, and we'll get to more examples of that as we continue. This is the view out the back end of my flat, looking over the rooftops of Ida. You have the local health centre and school in the background there, both run by UNRWA, which is a UN organisation set up specifically to provide healthcare and schooling to many of these refugees who otherwise, still 8 decades later would not have access to that. And that's why we've seen over the last few years a very targeted attack on the reputation of UNRWA by Israel to try shut down those services. Also note the local mosque there in the camp. That woke me up at 4:30 a.m. the first morning. It was a great surprise. It sounded like it was right through the back wall. But then within a few days, you become very used to it, the call to prayer and the rhythms to the day, and it actually becomes this really wonderful thing. But I want to draw your attention to these water tanks on all of the rooftops there. So this isn't exclusive to the refugee camp, actually. Most Palestinian homes, you can recognize them because they have these water tanks, and that's because even in the West Bank, the Palestinian area, again, the whole area used to be Palestinian, but even in the West Bank, all of the water is actually controlled by Israel. And so 80% of it is funneled off to Israeli civilians, meanwhile only 20% is left for Palestinians, and that tap gets turned off and on whenever Israel likes. And so in the case of Ida Camp, they'll sometimes go a week or 2 weeks having no water coming through the pipes. And so they store it on the roof. But again, once you're out, you're out. And in fact, there was a period of 2 months while I was in the camp that we didn't have any water coming through the pipes. And so I had a friend coming around to my apartment to use my shower because he didn't have any water remaining. And of course, some very unique views as well from the rooftop of my apartment. This was in June as Israel and Iran were firing missiles back and forth between one another. The communities in the camp and across the West Bank don't have bomb shelters, and so instead many of them will go up to the rooftops to watch what they call the fireworks, because without any protection that makes it less of a fearful thing for the children. You kind of turn it into a thing of excitement instead in order to negate the trauma of these missiles that can be shot down over top of communities in the West Bank who do not have aerial protection. But I want to draw your attention to the wall in the background there. So this is the wall. Israelis will call it the separation wall or the security barrier. Palestinians call it the apartheid wall because of how it segregates a lot of their land and blocks them from particular areas. In many places it looks like this, a kind of 8 to 9 meter towering concrete wall with these watchtowers in it. In other places it's a chain-linked fence with big rolls of barbed wire. In theory, Israel calling it a security barrier, you would expect it to run around the outskirts then of the West Bank. But in reality, it actually cuts in through large swathes of the West Bank, isolating towns from one another and cutting off Palestinians from their own farmland. And so actually, this is a much more accurate representation of what the West Bank looks like. And then internally, there's more separation and kind of, it's cut up like a very messy cake, and we'll get to some more of that later. But this is one example of what that can look like. This is looking into Bethlehem City from Jerusalem. And Ida Camp's just the other side of that wall. These olive groves here, though, they are owned by residents who live inside of Bethlehem. And so now they're cut off from their land. And so what was once a 5-minute walk becomes maybe an hour and a half journey or longer if they even have the right permits to be allowed through these checkpoints to go and farm their land. And if they don't farm their land, then after 3 years under Israeli law it becomes wasteland and the ownership transfers to the state. And so, again, similar to our own history here in Aotearoa, you see laws written into being for the purpose of transferring land ownership from the indigenous communities who have lived and farmed there for generations to the state, and then often those are gifted for settlements. Again, this photo I actually took last year in the little house down here in the corner. I was showing the family I was living with in Ida Camp this, and they said, "Oh wait, go back, that's our family house." On the other side of the wall. And they then told me their entire family, most of them have permits to be able to go and visit or live in this house, except their father has been refused because he once worked for the Palestinian police. And so again, if they want to live together as a family, they are forced to live inside the West Bank. So this happens all the time. Also, if a Palestinian from Gaza wants to marry someone in the West Bank, neither of them will be granted visas to go and live with the other one. And so if they want to be together as a couple, they have to go and live elsewhere. So again, just the mundanity of these legal systems created to take land and to expel residents. Moving on a bit further, slightly outside of Bethlehem is some friends of mine called the Nassars. This is Daher Nassar. They are a wonderful Palestinian Christian family. Yes, Palestinian Christians exist. For anyone who isn't aware, this is where our faith community began, and communities like this have stewarded the Christian faith in the land since the book of Acts, the day of Pentecost. So Daher, he's just a wonderful man. He's one of those guys you could just listen to sharing his stories all day long about growing up on the farm and the olive harvest and living in the caves that they dug out of the hillside, and he's just the loveliest guy. And this is their farmland. On a clear day you can see right out to the Mediterranean coastline. It's a beautiful little haven with olive groves and grapevines. But if you turn to the left, this is the view you get. Looking across the valley to the hillsides opposite, where every other hilltop in their area has had an illegal Israeli settlement built on it. So these are townships built exclusively for Jewish Israelis on land that has been taken from Palestinians, land like the Nassar family farm. And actually, similarly, the Nassars have been in a 35-year legal battle to hold on to their land, proving again and again that the land's theirs. They have all the ownership papers, and yet the case keeps getting adjourned and adjourned and adjourned as they attempt to force this family off the land that they have farmed for generations. And the latest rendition of this is just over the back fence. This caravan was installed in around June last year. It's a pretty innocent looking caravan to us here in Aotearoa, but what this is actually an outpost. So the settlements are illegal under international law, but these outposts are illegal even under Israeli law. But the military and the police who control this area will do nothing about it. They don't remove it. And so the caravan continues, and so when I returned in June this year, it had expanded. And they were excavating the land and preparing to build. They had already installed electricity. And in fact, just a week or two ago, I got sent this update from a friend who was at the olive harvest on the farm. There are now multiple housing units right next door. Now again, this isn't on the Nassar family land, but being right over the fence, it becomes an issue because again, in this court case, being a Palestinian family living just over the fence from this settlement, they are considered a security threat. And so again, this could be the beginning of the end of their many, many years on the farm. And of course, this also comes with, increased settler activity. They've had settlers for many years coming onto their farm, uprooting the olive groves, bulldozing trees. In fact, 2/3 of their farm down the hill further aren't actually safe for them to access anymore. And so through settlements and outposts like these, you see a bit more, this is that West Bank that we saw before becomes more and more splintered, and then you've got settler-only roads, you've got closed military zones, and as a result, you just have these little enclaves of Palestinian land where they can continue to live safely. And in between that, they're being forced off the land, or it's not even safe for them to be there in the first place. And so again, that map that we saw before starts to look a little more like this. And while we're talking about the Nassars, I want to focus just briefly on Palestinian Christians, because I think often there's a misunderstanding, if people are even aware of Palestinian Christians, a misunderstanding that they're being driven out of the land by Muslims, but this is not the reality. This is what so many Palestinian Christians say. No, our problem has never been Islam. Yes, there are tensions, as there are anywhere, as there are here in Aotearoa, but our problem is we're living under Israeli occupation and domination. We are being forced off our homes by these systems. And so this here is the village of Taibeh. It's the only fully Palestinian Christian village in the West Bank. And twice this year alone, it's had settlers coming into the village and setting the grass on fire to try and burn down Al-Khara, the church of St. George. This is one of the oldest churches in the world. And they are trying to burn it down. In fact, they burnt some of the neighboring cemetery during those attacks. And just a few weeks later, my friend sent me these images out the front of his house. Settlers had come and set fire to a number of the cars and had left this graffiti. I can't recall the exact translation, but I think from memory it was something along the lines of, you have no future here, which there are signs being put up on the main highways as well, telling Palestinians they have no future in their own land. The holiday of Sabt al-Nur, which I mentioned before, the Saturday of Light, this wonderful Christian tradition that has been undergone for 1,400 years. Under Israeli occupation, the old city where it is held is basically placed under siege for the day. Checkpoints and police barring anyone from entering the city unless you have a special wristband, including even within the city. One of my friends who lives in the Christian Quarter, he stepped out his front door that day and there was a police checkpoint right outside. And they said, no, you can't come out this door, you have to go out a different way. And so even for residents who live in the old city, there's this crackdown on where they can visit. Once they leave the city, they're not allowed back in. People trying to reach the church, there was a Catholic scout leader who had a gun pulled out and pointed right in his face. There's often violence, and even inside the church itself, there were police dictating where people could stand and who could move where. So that even these ancient traditions are under attack. And then finally, I want to share with you the story of Layan Nasser. I met with Layan's mother, Lulu, last year, and she explained Layan is a 25-year-old Palestinian Christian and Anglican like me. She lives in the West Bank in the town of Birzeit, and in April last year, she was abducted from her home at gunpoint by Israeli soldiers. They woke at 4 a.m. to a loud knock on the door, and Layan's mother, Lulu, opened the door to find around a dozen heavily armed soldiers pointing their guns in her face and saying, "Shh, or we'll shoot. We're in a state of war, we can do whatever we like." And so they took Lulu and her husband through to the lounge at gunpoint, and then they went through to Layan's room where they zip-tied her hands together, blindfolded her and took her away, without explaining why she was being taken, what crime she had committed, where she was being taken to, and how they could get in touch, how long she was going to be held. And so Layan actually ended up being held in Israeli captivity for 8 months last year with no charge or trial. And she's just one of over 3,500 other Palestinians who are currently held without charge or trial. And this has been going on for many, many years. So again, it starts to raise this really clear double standard when in particular communities we talk, quite rightly, we talk about the Israeli hostages being held in Gaza and the need to have them released. But if we're not also mentioning the thousands of Palestinian political prisoners, hostages, who are being held and have been held for many, many years without charge or trial, it raises this really double standard. And Layan actually, so she was released in December, and she was back with her family, and they were very obviously overjoyed. And you can watch some of Leanne's interviews speaking about what she faced in prison. There's many well-documented reports about physical, verbal, sexual abuse in prisons, psychological abuse, starvation. This has been going on for many, many years. Actually, just 2 weeks ago, in fact, the very day that this peace deal was announced in Gaza, Leanne was actually detained yet again and will spend another 8 months held in captivity, and she still doesn't even know what she's been charged for. And I also just want to take this opportunity to emphasize, so there's 3,500 who haven't had charge or trial, but even the thousands more, there's currently over 9,000 Palestinians held by Israel. The thousands more who have had a trial, many of them have not had a fair trial. I actually sat in on some of the court cases at Ophir Military Court last year with an organisation who write reports about particularly children being put through these military courts. Israel is the only country in the world that will put children through military courts. There are currently 400 children being held by Israel. And these trials that we saw were just a farce. Every single one of them was adjourned till a later date while they negotiated a plea bargain, because when you're in the system, often the fastest or even only way for many people to get out of these systems is to plead guilty. Whether you committed the crime or not, whether you even know what crime you're being held for, because a lot of the time it's based on secret evidence that even the lawyers aren't allowed to see. So there's no justice. So again, important stuff to keep in mind. Moving on down to Al Khalil, Hebron, in the southern West Bank. Hebron is it is the biggest city in Palestine. That used to be a title actually held by Gaza City, but under the current Israeli genocide there, it has become Hebron City is the largest. And when I visited Hebron last year, I went and met with my friend Ayman, who I showed you with his shisha pipe, and we hopped in a car and drove around to his house, and as we reached his street, we had to stop, because even in the middle of this Palestinian city, in broad daylight, there were around a dozen soldiers walking down the street with their guns, searching cars, turning people around at gunpoint, and so we just had to hop out of the car and stand back and wait for about 20 to 30 minutes as they did these checks, and then as they left, just for good measure, they fired off 2 tear gas canisters. You can see in this video, it doesn't really show much other than that I was a bit slower to run than everyone else, because they're very familiar with what is happening. Has anyone been tear gassed before? A few people, yeah. I hope for the rest of you that you never are. It feels like having chili powder thrown in your eyes, and you just physically, it's like you've forgotten how to breathe. It is suffocating. And this was in a street, just 2 canisters in a street where it dispersed fairly quickly, but some people have had tear gas fired into their homes. In fact, a friend of my mate James actually died years ago in Hebron. He had tear gas fired into his house, and it triggered a heart attack, and when the ambulance came to help, the ambulance was on one side of the checkpoint and he was on the other, just about 10 meters apart, and the soldiers wouldn't let either of them through, and so he died. And in fact, I was sharing this story last year down in Dunedin, and a wonderful community leader there, Dr. Mai Tamimi, she stood up and she said, yes, I grew up in Hebron, and this was so common that we would take a half slice of onion to school with us each day, because you kind of breathe it in like this antidote to the tear gas every day on her way to school. That's how common this stuff is. And when she said that, it actually reminded me, these soldiers, once they had cleared out, all of these parents arrived, and they opened the gates beside where the soldiers had fired off this tear gas, and all of the kids came out, and they'd fired it off from outside a school in the middle of Hebron. And the reason that soldiers are in the middle of the city is because even right in the middle of the city, those settlements I told you about on the hilltops earlier exist right here. The upper, back one slide. The upper levels of these homes are now being lived in by Israeli settlers, while the bottom level Palestinians have managed to hold on to their shops, and so they still try to go about their daily lives. But not only do you have this very visible power dynamic of settlers above, Palestinians below, you can see this kind of netting structure over top of the marketplace. That's to prevent settlers from throwing their trash down on Palestinians as they shop and go about their lives underneath. And so they throw it down even into these closed-off roads that Palestinians can't go into to clear any of the trash away, and so it sits, and it ferments, and the smell seeps through into the houses next door, and so life becomes unbearable, and people leave. And it's happening all the time. The old city of Hebron, which was this beautiful, bustling, very historical place, is emptying out. It's like a ghost town, more and more. And in fact, even in the middle of the city, you have checkpoints. So not just between cities, but even right in the middle. This is actually the entrance to Ibrahimi Mosque, one of the most sacred sites for Christians, Muslims, and Jews. It's the burial place of Abraham and Sarah. But for Palestinians, Christians and Muslims, wanting to go in there, they have to go through these incredibly dehumanizing checkpoints, where they could be stopped, they could be strip searched, beaten, they could just be denied entry. Imagine if coming here tonight to get into the cathedral, you had to go through a checkpoint like this, and you sit here for an hour knowing that at the end you have to go back out through it again. This is constant. But then even if you make it through, you have these security cameras actually inside the mosque, watching people as they gather. The mosque is a very communal place. There's picnics, weddings, of course worship as well, and the whole time you're being surveilled by the Israeli military. And this photo here is particularly poignant to us in Christchurch. I took this in 2019 when I first visited. And just 3 weeks later, I woke up to a text on my phone from my mum telling me about the horrific terror attack that had happened here at Al-Noor Mosque. Friends of mine who lost their loved ones. And not only was it absolutely horrifying seeing these scenes of our city and the violence that our own communities faced, but it was jarring because the information I was reading was exactly the same story I had heard just 3 weeks earlier in Ibrahimi Mosque. Back in 1994, during Friday worship, an American-Israeli doctor walked into the mosque and opened fire and killed 29 people worshipping there, injured 125 others. And in response, there was outrage. People took to the streets and said, Israel, you are the occupying power. You have a responsibility to protect us. How was this able to happen? How was a gunman able to enter? How was this able to happen? And in response to this anger, in response to these demonstrations, instead of addressing the root issue, Israel instead, for, again, security purposes, they closed off Shuhada Street, the main street that runs right through the center of Hebron. It would be like the equivalent of shutting off Riccarton Road. So if you live on one side and work on the other, suddenly life becomes a whole lot more difficult. Either a half-hour journey round or you're going through these checkpoints. It's very unpredictable. And 30 years later, this road remains closed to Palestinians. But Jewish Israelis, settlers, come and go freely whenever they like. This Hajj from the local mosque, he can come and go because he actually still lives on one of the houses on the street. But he has to make sure that someone is constantly supervising his house if he's not there. Because if they leave their houses empty, settlers are watching and they'll see and they will go in, they'll throw out the Palestinian owners' belongings and they'll bring in their own, and once they're in there, there's nothing you can do. Because the military won't help, the police won't help, they always side with the settlers. Their sole mandate is to protect the settlers within the West Bank. So Hebron, as I say, is where you see, I think, the more static elements of the occupation, very confronting. But actually, if you go a bit further south, you'll visit Masafir Yatta. I think this is where you actually see it at its most active. Masafir Yatta is a series of rural townships, around 20 little villages scattered amongst the hillsides, and placed amongst each of them are these illegal settlements on each of the hilltops, kind of isolating them and cutting them off from one another. And so you have what happened here, which was, this is Hamoudi, who I met last year, my mate, and he, within 5 minutes of meeting him and arriving, he did the classic Palestinian thing. He boiled up a cup of tea, and he said, here you go, bro, come with me. I'm going to show you our farm. And so we walked up the hill, and within minutes of getting onto their farmland, these two settlement security came down from Havat Ma'on, the illegal outpost behind the trees there, and they said to us, no, you can't be here, you have to go back. And Hamoudi, armed with his very dangerous cup of tea, he stood his ground and he said, no, this is my land. We have military police coming here all the time. You need a written military permit to send us away. Do you have a written permit? And there was a bit of back and forth and a bit tense, but eventually they kind of backed off and we continued on around his farm. And we went down to their family garden where I met Hafez, his father, who every morning and every evening is up on the farm, watering their crops, replanting them if they've been cut down or uprooted by settlers during the night. Hafez back in 2022 was actually attacked while farming on his land. There were 4 settlers came down from the nearby settlement, one of them armed with a gun, and they started beating him, and all he had was his shovel to defend himself, but if he had tried, the settler standing there with the gun would have acted, and so he could do nothing, and both of his arms were broken during this attack. But when the military turned up, they ignored these 4 settlers, and instead they accused Hafez of having attacked them, and so Hafez was arrested and taken away, and he was actually held for 10 days in Israeli captivity with both of his arms broken. And he was only released because, fortunately, a French activist had been nearby filming the whole thing from a distance. And the video footage was undeniable that he had been attacked, and so the court had to release him, cleared him of charges, but they still charged him around 5,000 to 10,000 New Zealand dollars in order to be released, even though they said he'd done nothing wrong. And the settlers faced no consequences. I also just want to point out in the background here, this grey blob on the left-hand side is a military watchtower that's been placed right in the middle of the family's farm, kind of overlooking their village. Again, is this very visible sign of surveillance and domination with the flag as well. We are watching you. And it's relentless. I mean, they face this all the time. Soldiers coming into their homes at night time. It can happen at any stage. In fact, Hamoudi, who I showed you before, he has actually been arrested. He was first arrested at the age of 14, and he's been arrested at least 9 times since then. That was this time last year. It's probably around a dozen times this year. And of course, they also face the constant threat of settler violence in big or small amounts. But it's not just injuries, it's also death. I actually went after this and met Hamoudi's cousin, Zakaria, who in October 2023 was shot by an Israeli settler. He was leaving the local mosque, and the settler just walked up and from about 1.5 meters away shot him with an explosive bullet, which is an illegal munition under international law because it's designed to explode on impact. And so Zakaria is incredibly lucky to be alive. He spent over 200 hours in the ICU. He's had multiple surgeries, but still, I visited him again this year to check in, and he's on the mend, but he still can't work. He still can't travel easily across the hillsides like he used to, helping the community. He can barely pick up his kids to play with them. So for him, the repercussions go on. Now this next clip here, this was filmed by Basil, who's Zakaria's cousin. This was the final image in the Oscar-winning documentary this year, No Other Land. This was filmed, I'll play it because there's a few things I want to point out to you. So this was actually the attack on Zakaria. It was caught on camera. And I want to point out here the soldier in the background, just strolling around. As I said before, the soldiers' only mandate within the West Bank is to protect Israeli civilians. So they're not there to prevent this kind of stuff. They're not there to uphold law. They're not there to protect Palestinians and Israelis equally. They're there solely to protect Israeli settlers. And so you can kind of see him and be like, oh, come on, come back, mate, that was a bit much. But he's not doing anything about it. And in fact, a lot of the time, these soldiers are also settlers themselves. And so not only will they kind of facilitate or allow this violence, they'll actually participate in it as well. And we'll see some more examples of that as we go on. But, we also saw settler violence right in front of us. We were up on the farm with Hafez, and 3 settlers came down from Havat Ma'un outpost armed with their M16s and started shoving and abusing Hafez in front of us.
אל תקרב לשם, תרגע, אל תקרב אליי, אל תקרב אליי. אני לא מתקרב לך. זהו, תשאר פה. אין לך תעודות? התחיל לדחוף אותי ו... אין בעיה. יש לך תעודות? רוצה להזדהות? להביא תעודה?
And again, in this case, they then came to us and they said, show us your ID, me and a Swiss guy who was there. And we said, no, we've called the military and the police. We'll tell them when they came. Sorry, we've called the police. The police didn't come, but the military came. And again, when they arrived, they ignored these 3 armed settlers. And they came straight to me and the Swiss guy and they said, this guy, pointing to one of the settlers, is a soldier. who had never told us or identified, very sloppy uniform, we had no idea. And so we actually ended up getting arrested on charges of preventing military from doing their duty. Again, because they don't want internationals in this place documenting this kind of stuff. It was just intimidation. For me, I then spent the final month of being there without my passport because they refused to return it. So I was traveling around, and only got it back when I showed them proof of my departure. But again, for us, it was a kind of mild intimidation, but we weren't scared of violence or imprisonment or death, whereas for Palestinians, it's a very different story. In fact, when we were being held in the police van, the row in front of us, there was a Palestinian farmer who had been arrested at the same time, and he was sat in front of us with his hands zip-tied behind him, and again, a blindfold on. Very clear difference. We weren't zip-tied, we weren't blindfolded, and when we got to the police station, he was released within about an hour, which I'd say sends a pretty clear message that there wasn't any reason to detain him, and certainly not to be zip-tying or blindfolding him. He was not a threat, but this happens all the time, and it's the constant intimidation and harassment and terror. And he wasn't returned to his village afterwards. He wasn't given a ride back. Often they're just dumped in a random place and have to find their own way home. So this stuff happens all the time. But it doesn't just happen in individual scenarios either. We hopped on donkeys and rode for about half an hour to this wonderful village, Khalet Daba, on this hillside with some trees and beautiful houses and just a lovely community. But just 3 weeks after we were there, they faced a massive pogrom where settlers lit their crops on fire down in the valley, and then they came around and up the back of the hill, around 100 to 200 settlers to attack the community.
من شو رايكم؟ خلاص نفسك؟ إيه؟
So in this particular attack, 2 Italian activists who were there were beaten. One of them managed to escape and spent the whole night balled up on the roadside hoping for his life that he wouldn't be found. One of the residents had both of his legs broken, all of their solar panels were smashed, and one of the houses was completely burnt out. And again, no repercussions for the settlers doing this. And you can see just on the left-hand side here the end of a mural that actually says, "We deserve life." And in fact, all the homes in Khalet Daba, when I visited in June last year, had these very sobering murals on them because the entire village had been placed under what we call demolition orders. So this is, the Israeli occupation authorities will say these structures have been built without permits. They're illegal. And yet when Palestinians apply for the permits, they're practically impossible to get as a Palestinian. And so this village, which has actually been here since before Israel even existed as a state in 1948, was placed under demolition order, and they followed through. This was exactly what they did earlier this year across a series of 3 mass demolitions. They flattened the entire village, the whole hillside, including the tents that were put up, leaving the whole community homeless. But they continue to stay there. They say, why would we leave? This is our home. We'll rebuild, we'll keep rebuilding. They can't make us leave. And in fact, in June last year, we actually saw some of these demolitions taking place nearby in the village of Al Khair. We heard that they had begun these demolitions, and so some of us jumped in a car and we drove around to get there, and we found our way blocked. The main road entry was blocked by an Israeli military vehicle. So instead we parked up and we walked across the valley, and I'll never forget this view as we came up over the hilltop to families who had been kicked out of their home, being held back by rows of soldiers, and so all they can do is sit there and watch while their homes are obliterated. Sorry. And so in one day, 11 homes were demolished, leaving almost 40 people without shelter in the heat of summer, 30 of them kids. And they'll try to appeal to the soldiers and say, do you have no compassion? This is my house. Like, do you have no humanity? But the soldiers will just say, we're just doing our job. Because this is how the system is set up. So again, no one takes individual responsibility for these atrocities. And the families are left to clean up the rubble. And to bring in your own heavy machinery requires permits, which Palestinians can't get. And so instead, they have to spend weeks chipping their own home into even smaller pieces to clear it away by hand. So this was 3 weeks on. It continued. It looked much the same. All of the rubble was still around.
I have no words to describe what they do to us. It's really very hard. I mean, my kitchen is here. Some toys, some clothes. It is a work paper for my daughter. She were in the school, and before the holiday.
And so for families like Eid's, they're left without home. He has many young kids, so him and his wife actually, just a month after this last footage, he sent me this next clip. The families had got some international funding to buy tents, and they had started to kind of rebuild some semblance of life in their village. But the tents, again, didn't have permits, and so the military returned.
Israeli bulldozers back, and they knocked down, the homes which donated to the families.
And so they faced this relentless campaign of rebuild, destroy, rebuild, destroy. And when I returned this year, they had finally cleared the rubble off of Eid's house, so he's just got the foundation now. You can see the remains of his kitchen cabinetry on the left-hand side there. His daughter has actually painted some flowers onto that, because to her it's still home. That's where they belong, and so she's trying to re-beautify it, but she's also got huge trauma from having her home demolished right in front of her eyes, and the trauma that it can happen again at any stage. So Eid actually spent all of the very hot summer living in this tin shed of his neighbours with his young family, and then again a very cold winter, a very cold and wet winter. This is not an insulated, shelter. This is not waterproof, so it's leaking in lots of places. Many other families spent that time living in tents, as I say, and so it continues. But during that time as well, they were still facing the threat of settler violence. So every day they have settlers coming into their homes, and you can see in this photo, the lights in the background there, that's Carmel settlement. So these families, this whole community of Khair, they're actually refugees from the Nakba, the 1948 displacement, expulsion of these Palestinian communities. They fled the Nakab or Negev desert in the south of what is now Israel, and they came here. And they sold over half of their flocks of camel and sheep in order to buy this land from the locals and began to rebuild life. But then in 1981, Carmel settlement was established over top of half of their farmland. And so now they face settlers and soldiers coming into their village whenever, particularly during the night. And there's nothing that you can do to prevent that, but they'll have people on night watch to see if any of this is happening so that they can document it, because it's, again, like in Hafez's case, it's very important to have it on film, because otherwise the settler's word will always be trusted. And again, they can't prevent any of it, but at least they can wake up the children, which makes it less terrifying when suddenly there's soldiers barging into your house and taking away your dad. And many of these kids have huge trauma and nightmares that their home will be demolished again, or that their dad will be taken and arrested, and that happens all the time. In fact, this here is my friend Alda, 31 years old, father of 3, proud Bedouin. He's a massive football fan, an English teacher at the local primary school, and just a light of the community. So many internationals who visited the village just say, oh, he's just the most generous, welcoming person. He's staunchly committed to non-violence in response to all this violence, which is just incredible. And actually in July this year, oh no, hang on, let me play this first. He's just lovely, and he was the first person I met in Khair. He kind of showed me around, he told me their story and what they were facing, and I was constantly getting WhatsApp updates from him.
Do bye one more time?
يلا بابا قول goodbye قول goodbye يلا امشي امشي goodbye bye 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 bye
Just the loveliest of guys. But in July this year, so he was filming from a distance. This is what he often does. When soldiers come into the village, when settlers come, he documents it. He's a human rights defender. His footage has been used in a lot of these human rights organisations' cases, and actually he was a big contributor to No Other Land, the Oscar-winning doco this year. And so he was again filming as settlers right behind the community centre were excavating land to extend the settlement right through the middle of this Palestinian village. And as that work finished for the day, one of these diggers began to roll across private Palestinian land, crushing their sewage pipe, their olive trees, their fences. And so the villagers came out and got in the way, trying to block this digger. It swung the boom and knocked Ahmed, one of them, out completely. And everyone thought he had been killed. And so they picked up stones and started throwing them at this digger to stop it, to send it away. This is a digger, it's designed for stones. And in response to this, Yinon Levy, the settler who was heading up these illegal excavations, he came over waving a gun. You can see in this next clip just the absolute manic look in his eyes as he waves his gun and fires off 2 shots in the direction of where people are standing.
Shoot me! Shoot me! Shoot me! Shoot me! Shoot me! Shoot me! Shoot me!
And it was the first of those shots that killed my friend Alda. It hit him in the chest and he collapsed. But when the military turned up, again, they ignored his killer, who was filmed on camera. In fact, there's other footage filmed by Alda himself from the community centre, 30 or 40 metres away. He wasn't even part of all of the chaos going on. They ignored this murder that had happened, and instead they took orders from Yinon Levy, who had killed Alda, on which of Alda's family members to arrest. And so over the next 3 days, over 20 of Alda's family were taken away to Ophir prison, where they faced beatings and harassment. All of this while they're mourning their cousin, their friend, their brother. And yet Yinon Levy was released back to home detention in less than 24 hours and cleared of all charges within 5 days. And a week later, he was back in the village, continuing excavation work right behind the community centre. He cut the water pipes, so over half the village had no running water. Meanwhile, just metres away in the community centre, the families continued to mourn, unable to bury Alda's body because Israeli authorities had seized it and were refusing to return it to the family. And this continued actually for 10 days until actually under pressure, because 60 of the village's women went on hunger strike, including Alda's mum, his sister, and his wife, starving themselves just in order to bury their loved one. And so finally, Israel were forced to release his body 10 days later, but even then, military set up a checkpoint at the entrance to the village and the main highway to prevent people attending the funeral. And so many of Alda's closest friends weren't able to give him a proper farewell. I was fortunate to be in the village the night before, and so I only had one of these checkpoints in the way. And so me and some others walked down and snuck along the bottom of the valley out of eyesight just in order to get to the school where Alda's funeral was held. But we held the funeral, and hundreds still made it. And we farewelled our friend Alda, but there's still no sense of justice, because again, his killer remains out there. And is known who he is. And many countries around the world actually, prior to this attack even, had sanctions on Yinon Levy because he was such a dangerous settler, and yet it didn't change a thing, because his impunity doesn't come from Britain or New Zealand. His impunity comes from the very top of the Israeli system. This is de facto policy across the West Bank and even within the Israeli territories themselves. And I also just want to highlight New Zealand. When I say New Zealand sanctioned him, what I mean is we placed a travel ban on him. So he can't holiday in New Zealand. And we expect that that's going to change this system. And so the excavation continued, and last time I was there, they had placed 4 housing units, splitting the village in half, cutting off electricity and water to over 100 residents in the south. And pretty soon there's going to be a road put through which will also cut off road access. And so like the first time I visited, they'll have to walk down and across the valley just to get to and from their homes. And you can see Khair over here being encroached on more and more by Carmel settlement. And there's farming outposts all around as well. So for this Bedouin community, you know, their tradition is herding sheep, and they don't even have access to the land to herd their sheep on. So they're losing their cultural traditions as well. And in fact, just last week, I got sent this photo. This is my friend Ali Hathaleen, Alda's cousin, holding more demolition orders And so the community was served these demolition orders just this week. Oh, it's okay, we can keep the sound down on this one actually. For 13 more homes and the community centre that at some stage in the next few weeks will also be flattened. They were given 4 days to appeal this. And even if they had, it wouldn't make a difference because, again, the courts rule in the favour of the settlers. Or even when the courts rule against the military and the settlers, those orders are barely ever followed. The military just ignore them, and we've got a story of that later as well. And then just yesterday I got sent this footage of, again, settlers down in the valley grazing their sheep on Palestinian trees. And so, you know, it's the middle of olive harvest season at the moment, and they can't even harvest their own olives safely. 2 of them were beaten with sticks, 1 of them was arrested, and in fact just last night I was sharing these stories in Invercargill. I got a text halfway through the presentation from Ali saying that the settlers had come into the village that morning and begun construction on this road which is going to cut off access to the southern half of the village. So again, I just share that this continues day in and day out. And I want to clarify that these are not isolated incidents. This isn't like, oh, that's really unfortunate, but this is happening all across the West Bank. Up north here, around Nablus last year, I visited the village of Kusra, who also had gates installed to prevent entry from their village. There's now only one way in and out that can be closed off at any stage. They had their power cut and olive trees bulldozed and pushed right up on top of some of their homes, demolishing those as well. Down here around Ramallah, I actually documented the funeral of Saif Musalat and Mohammed al-Shalabi, a 20 and 23-year-old Palestinian boys who were beaten to death by settlers. One was shot, one was beaten, and again, no settlers faced any consequences. This stuff continues all the time, as I say, de facto policy. But it's also, none of it is new either. So if we go here to West Jerusalem, we visit the village of Lifta. Lifta is one of those 530 villages I mentioned at the start. So during the Nakba, the creation of Israel, 750,000 Palestinians forcibly expelled, 530 villages wiped off the map, 15,000 killed in a series of over 100 massacres. So I emphasize this again because particularly for me, within my Christian faith community, there's ideas around there that people speak about this as this fulfillment of prophecy. Oh, Israel have returned to the land. This is not prophecy. This is slaughter. This is apartheid. These theologies directly contradict the very nature of Christ as a loving, caring God, a God of everyone, and everyone being made in the image of God. So Lifta is one of these villages, as I say, and I was actually fortunate to visit Lifta with Jakob Aude, who's now 84 years old. He grew up in Lifta, and at the age of 8 he was expelled, but he's able to return to visit, not to rebuild, and he showed me around, and he was sharing with me these stories of, oh man, these are the streets we used to race down coming home to see who could get home first from school. That's the bakery where my mum would make the most delicious bread. He points across the valley, oh, that over there, that's the house that I was born and grew up in. That's where my eyes saw the light for the first time. That's the shop we used to go try steal lollies from the lady in there. Just these rich memories of a childhood which has now been lost when he was kicked out at the age of 8. And he spent his life actually just living just 10 minutes drive away in occupied East Jerusalem. So he can visit, he can still see his village, but he cannot return. Israel have barred him from returning, and that's the same for many Palestinians across the land. And I mean, you can imagine just the beauty of this place before its destruction. If we go further north, right up near the border with Lebanon is Ikrit village. In fact, the next hillside over in the background there is Lebanon. This was a Christian village, which again, in 1948, the Zionist militias arrived, and the residents here said, we're not going to fight you, but we're not going to flee. Like, we're going to stay here, please, just don't hurt us. And the military said, okay, we won't hurt you, but we need your land for military purposes. Just for 2 weeks, leave. And so under this threat of, no, you have to leave, they left. And 2 weeks later, they tried to come back, and they were told, no, we just needed another 2 weeks. And then more weeks passed, and months. And in fact, 2 years later, the newly established Israeli High Court ruled that the military had to allow the residents to return to Ikrit village and its neighbouring Birim village, both Christian villages. But instead, the military ignored those orders, and they came into the village on Christmas Eve, and they bombed and bulldozed every single house. And so the church is the only thing left standing there today. And so residents will come once or twice a month, and they'll have church services here. but they're denied the right to return to rebuild their homes. The only right, they say, is for them to return horizontal, to be buried in the village cemetery. But again, in this form of active non-violent resistance, creative resistance, a bunch of the young people back in 2014 began an occupation similar to up in Iho Mātau, where they just said, well, we have a right to return, so we're just going to do it. And so they went up there, and they've been living on the land, having a constant presence there, living in the church, replanting the crops, trying to rebuild the homes as a statement. We have a right to return. This is our village. Many of them just live in surrounding villages now, just 10 minutes to half an hour away. And yet again, Israel doesn't let them return. And many more of these villages just lie today as rubble in nature reserves and Israeli national parks. 77% of these villages have never even been built on, and yet these refugees continue to live in over 60 camps across the region, like Ida Camp, denied their right to return to their homes. And that's why you see this widespread rejection of the Israeli state, not because it's Jewish, but because it was established exclusively for one ethnic religious group over and on top of the homes and livelihoods of all of these communities. And that's why you've seen a lot of the resistance movements and uprisings begin in refugee camps. So until this is addressed, until there is justice, how can there be peace? Because to talk to Palestinians about justice, about peace without justice just is talking about submission to the system that is actively displacing and imprisoning and erasing them from the land. And we're witnessing right now this genocide in Gaza as a continuation of that, but this is the same violence that Israel was established on. And folks like Abu Nasser, who grew up in Ikrit village and was expelled again at the age of around 12, they know this. These are the stories they carry. You ask any Palestinian, and they carry the stories of what their family faced during the Nakba, or the other forms, the other periods of expulsion that Palestinians have faced. So the final location I want to take you to on this trip beyond pilgrimage is up west of Nablus. It's actually the illegal settlement of Kane Shomron. So me and my mate James here, we got introduced through a friend of an associate to this man, Shmuel Junger, who heads up an organization called Christian Friends of Israeli Communities. So this is an organization specifically funded by Christians in countries like New Zealand, America, the UK, and Europe. And its explicit thing that it funds is settlements. That's it. And within settlements, their main project is settlement security. So what you have is Christians here on the other side of the world funding the fences that are used to cut Palestinians off from their farmland, the drones that were flying over top watching us while we were on the farm outside of Bethlehem, the security cameras that constantly surveilled the nearby Palestinian towns relentlessly. In fact, we visited the security room with Shmuel, and there's just a 15-year-old girl sitting there on her phone, checking the cameras occasionally. She sees a Palestinian car do one too many laps of the nearby roundabout and dials in the community watch team to go and sort it out. And so it doesn't extend to the guns, but it doesn't need to because, well, as far as I know, it doesn't extend to the guns. But following October 7, Ben-Gvir, who's the security minister, one of these extremist ministers within the Israeli government, a fundamentalist, a settler himself, he handed out over 10,000 guns to these settlers as well. And so what you have is Christians here on the other side of the world, knowingly or unknowingly, funding these private settler militia that go and continue to attack and displace Palestinian communities across the West Bank. And in fact, there's organisations here in Aotearoa, Christian Friends of Israel, New Zealand, who support and fund Christian Friends of Israeli communities. So this isn't far from home, particularly also when we look at the relationships, the trade relationships we have as a nation, the allies that we have who are funding and sending the weaponry for all of these crimes. So although we're geographically distant, we are very connected. But I also share this story because I want to emphasize these extremes. So we're chatting with Shmuel. He took us up to this hilltop in the settlement and he pointed around, look at all of these dangerous Arab towns. They're expanding, we're facing constant violence. All of these things he described were what we had seen actually from the settlers. But he says, people ask us why we live here if it's so dangerous for us. And I tell them, we're crazy. And I thought, yeah, but we're fulfilling prophecy. And this is what he so deeply believes. And also what many of our Christian communities around the world believe, that they are funding and supporting this kind of twisted fulfillment of prophecy, and so often it's completely disconnected from this reality on the ground. But although these are extreme fundamentalist views, they're not fringe within Israeli society. This here is a photo I took last year at the Flag March, which is an annual event that takes place across Israel. It's a national holiday, but in the old city of Jerusalem, you have tens of thousands of these ultra-nationalist settlers, many of them young teens fueled up on testosterone, marching through the old city streets, particularly the Muslim and Christian quarters, waving their flags, chanting things like "Death to the Arabs, may your village burn, the Prophet Muhammad is dead," insults to Jesus as well. And it happens every year. And this was before the event even began. You had these young gangs of settler youth running up and down the streets looking for stalls to vandalize and Palestinians to attack. And this Palestinian journalist, Saif Kawazmi, was stood in front of me filming them on his phone, and one of them snatched his phone from him. And so he grabbed it back, and the crowd just ignited and lunged forward, and he was very lucky not to get pulled into the mix. But then the police, who you see in the background there, they came barging through, and apparently for our safety, they shoved us all very violently back down this alleyway to get us out of the way of this mob. And then I turned around actually just in time to see one of them split off from the rest and hit Saif on the back of the head with his baton. And so again, I want to emphasize, the police, the military, the settlers, they all work hand in hand. It's very much de facto policy, even the courts as well, but then when the courts aren't working in hand with these guys, they just ignore it and they continue this campaign. These extremes are not fringe. That was a brave young Israeli claiming a local mosque in the old city for Israel. This is the kind of stuff that continues to happen year on year. And this is an important point of the conversation to say that this, what you see here, does not represent Judaism. Judaism is a faith of goodness and justice and love. This is Zionism, which is the political ideology. It actually began as a secular political ideology to establish a Jewish-only state in the land where Jews, Christians, and Muslims had lived together for a very long time. So when we speak out against Israel, it is not anti-Semitism. We're not doing it because they are Jewish. In fact, this, as I say, this does not represent Judaism. And it's one of the biggest kind of twistings of this stuff. In fact, I would actually argue, I deeply believe that Israel as a state is the single most harmful thing to Jews around the world today, because these crimes and these atrocities across the West Bank and what we're seeing in Gaza are being committed, and they're saying they're committing these crimes in the name of Judaism, on behalf of Jews. And that's why you see many, many Jews around the world standing up and saying, no, this doesn't represent us, this is not in our name, this is not who we are, this does not represent our faith. Including a small handful as well of Jewish Israelis, like who are committed, best friends with Alda in some of these communities across the West Bank. They are working with Palestinians to confront these systems of injustice and to end this, what all these international human rights organizations have labeled a system of apartheid. And they all say to me, when I ask them, like, where does this go? They say, our work is barely stemming the flow. Like, it's important that we're here turning up and helping to protect these communities and to document these crimes, but Israeli society is not going to wake up and change their minds overnight. It requires international pressure. Only then will Israelis actually come to the table with genuine intentions to sort out a solution that is equality for all people in the land, because at the current moment, they don't have that. The international community is in many ways acting kind of business as usual. So again, it's become this kind of dichotomy between, oh, you're pro-Palestinian or pro-Israel. It's actually not. It's pro-humanity. What is good for Palestinians is good for Jews as well, because when you end these systems of domination, you aren't going to have movements gaining traction who are going to resist through armed means. And it's important to clarify that actually under international law, Palestinians, as an occupied people, have a right to resist occupation through any means, and that includes through armed means. Obviously, to stipulate, there's war crimes with it. Like, it's one of the most harmful things because armed resistance indiscriminately affects civilians as well. And so I want to emphasize, if we're not actually willing to support these non-violent pathways like international law, to uphold those things, then we cannot condemn violence, because we've never actually had to walk a day in the shoes of these Palestinian communities across the land. And actually, if we face the same violence here in Aotearoa, day after day for decades, met with the same indifference from the international community, you would see groups exactly like Hamas and others forming. And again, I don't say any of that to justify violence. As a Christian, I'm against violence, but if we actually want to prevent violence, we need to support non-violence, and the world has utterly failed Palestinians in that regard. So, with that wee lecture, now what? It would be a waste of all of our time to kind of gather here, see these stories, maybe shed a tear or two and feel good about our own compassion, but not actually do anything to help confront these systems. One of the most basic things that we can do is just be aware of the language we use. To call this a conflict, while it is not, it's not factually wrong, it is actually an active misframing, misrepresentation of the reality. This is apartheid. Apartheid is a legal definition, a legal term with a clear definition under international law. And when we don't call it that, we're actually actively misrepresenting the reality. Same with genocide. These are legal terms. In the same way that when we go to hospital, we get a diagnosis and we name these things, if we didn't have medical terms, we wouldn't be able to treat the root issues to help people get better. So how can we address this if we're not willing to actually name what this is? So that's one important thing. But here as well, if you have a phone, feel free to take a photo. This is some useful resources. Across the Divide is a fantastic Palestinian Christian-run podcast, interviewing people from all different facets of life there. Christ in the Rubble is a fantastic book by Reverend Dr. Muntha Isak. He's been one of the leading Palestinian voices over the last 2 years and longer back than that. No Other Land is, again, this Oscar-winning doco from this year. It's now available online, I think in most places that you can stream it, definitely on Apple. Aotearoa Christians for Peace in Palestine, that's a team that I'm involved with, specifically trying to create opportunities for our faith communities to engage on this issue in meaningful ways. And then a bunch of other useful resources, including me. Get in touch. I'm always happy to chat and happy to help. Here's also, for those of you on Instagram, here's some accounts you can follow. The left-hand side are mostly Palestinians reporting from on the ground, and the right-hand side are predominantly New Zealand-based organisations to be aware of local initiatives and ways that you can get involved in actually helping to confront some of these systems. And this is me down here, coal in a box. It's a good way to get in touch with me, if you would like. And finally, here are some prayers that we can pray. I write this instead of action because, again, as a Christian, often we talk about prayer as just this verbal thing, but actually prayer is also what we do with our hands and feet. It's what we do with our actions. If someone's starving in front of me, I'm not going to just pray for them to have food. I'm going to go get food and give it to them. We can be an answer to our prayers. So some of those ways we can do that, share these stories. I think particularly for any Christians in the room, this is the most important thing. There's such a lack of awareness within our faith community around how bad this actually is and how involved we are. This is an implicitly Christian problem. And so we actually need to confront these issues and these theologies within our own communities. Write to your MPs, particularly calling for sanctions. Again, sanctions are one of the most effective forms of non-violent power that we have as members of the international community. Sign petitions, attend demonstrations, donate and fundraise particularly for organisations in Gaza at the moment. Boycott, divestment, sanctions is again an incredibly powerful campaign of what we do with our money, how we spend our money feeds into systems that either help people or harm people. And so when we detract it from systems that are benefiting from war and from apartheid, that is what helps bring an end to those things. And we see that in the example of South Africa as well. And I should just clarify with this last one, that's not incitement. I just put it there to say that's a thing that some people do, and if you choose to do that, smile in your mugshot because you know you're on the right side of history. But anyway, before we kind of lead into Q&A, we want to finish with this 2-minute video. This is Jakub back in his village, Lifter, I filmed a short video with him, and as we finished filming for the day and walking back, he just kind of started mumbling to himself, and I thought it was really beautiful, so I kept recording.
None. We will come back. We will restore our land, our country, our village. Yes, we will not yield. By the support of people in this world, to be free in our country like them, like people everywhere, to be free in they are free in their countries, and we demand, we are struggling to be free in our land, in our homes. More than 1 million Palestinians jailed because they were struggling for freedom for their people and their land. And also 100,000 were killed as sacrifice for the freedom of their people. We will never yield. And we are sure, as the sun sets down, the sun will rise again.
Yeah, well, I think before we lead into the Q&A, I want to acknowledge that's a lot of really heavy stuff, and I think it's important to kind of sit in that for a short time, so we won't rush into Q&A, but yeah, maybe just take a breather, and yeah, just reflect on some of those things, including the fact that they are continuing to happen, you know, at this very moment, and then we can get into some Q&A.
Cole, thank you so much. I'm reminded of the quote that a single death is a tragedy and 1,000 deaths is a statistic. And so to ground what is happening in the faces of people, the stories of people, and seeing through your eyes is a really valuable thing for us. So I think it's appropriate to share our thanks with Cole for sharing that with us this evening. Shall we?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm aware some will need to leave. Feel free to do so if you need to. For the rest of us, I have also spent time sitting on those chairs. I know at this point it gets very uncomfortable. So before Q&A, can I suggest we stand and just shake a little and feel a little comfortable? Maybe quickly introduce yourself to the person that you've been sitting next to for the last 90 minutes or so. They are architecturally designed chairs, which is shorthand for uncomfortable. Yeah. Yes. Thank you, friends. Take a seat, take a seat. It's so lovely that we can have a chance to respond and ask questions. As Cole said, there is a great deal of weight in the stories that have been shared. So, a time for questions. As I said, please make sure they are questions rather than statements. Please make sure those questions are gracious and carefully worded. And if I ask you to cease a question, please do respect that. I'll wander around with this microphone so that others can hear the question as well as the answer. We'll do that for, I think, just a few minutes before a chance for more refreshments, and then Cole, you'll have some closing words in terms of some paper at the back and ways to support and things like that.
Now there's some paper at the back and ways to support and things like that. No, there's a sheet. There's a QR code again for the Aotearoa Christians for Peace website, but there's also just a sheet to write your contact details, so we can, you don't have to, but it would be great to kind of keep people aware of what's happening locally as well, and to be aware of kind of who was here, so we can contact you if there's any future events like this that you might like to come to. So that's just down the back and near to the food and beverages. So food and coffee.
You're also a little too whakamā to say, but I work for the church, so I know what a koha bag looks like, and it looks like there's one down the back there too. So feel free to support if you've got the means to do that. A time for questions. Kia ora.
Please, may I steal 2 questions? First of all, and there's many others, how are you?
Doing all right. It's a privilege for me getting to share this. It helps to process it. So it's a real privilege getting to carry these stories, and it helps me to have people hear them. So I'm doing well.
That's
a little
amazing.
bit physically tired.
Second question is, I received a really horrible letter from one of my elders. It started off, I know that you're pro-Palestinian. I said, how do you know that? Because I haven't seen any evidence of that. But basically I've worked out that about 2/3 of my church would be pro-Israel, and probably very upset by the fact that I even put out an invitation for them to come tonight. How do we deal with those pro-Israelis people in church, and how do we remain loving and share information?
Yeah, I think it's hard to do that because it's difficult, and often it's people we know and love as well. I have a couple of uncles who are Zionists, and I'm sure many other people here have different family members and friends who kind of hold some of these views. I think I've found it's really useful to ground me, to recognise that a lot of the time people are coming from decades of kind of indoctrination. Look at the media we've consumed and how dehumanising it has been of Islam, of Arab communities. And I mean, for my own parents' generation, for example, my parents are lovely, by the way, they're very on board, but their generation, grew up with this narrative around Israel being the plucky wee state defending itself from its dangerous Arab neighbours, really problematic narratives when you actually unpack it. But again, because we haven't created the space to examine these things as a church, we grew up in Sunday school and we read about Israel in the Bible as the chosen people, without really having a space to actually unpack what that meant in its original context anyway. And then we see a state with the same name today, kind of in the same vague area, and we just presume that they're a continuation of that. And so it leads to some really harmful theologies, as I say, often very disconnected from this reality on the ground. So for one, sharing these stories, share human stories. And as far as, it's very tricky. Some people will listen, some people won't. But the more, we just need to create opportunities, particularly for churches, to actually engage on this. Because most people, maybe it's naive, but I think most people, when they actually have this conversation, will quickly be like, is there actually basis to see modern Israel as a continuation? Maybe there's not. There isn't, to clarify. And we can unpack that further, maybe some. But I think it requires courageous conversations, and when those are met with an unwillingness to engage, then as a church we actually need to step into the holy work sometimes of disruption as well. When there are systems continuing to persecute, to subjugate and to murder Palestinians in their tens of thousands, we actually sometimes need to drive ourselves into that machinery in order to bring it to an end. So courage is what it requires as well.
Thank you. Yes, another question here.
Following on from that is this: how do we oppose the majority Christians, that are acting like that?
Same thing, I think. For those who can't see the phone, it's there's a number of groups around the country who go out waving Israeli flags and kind of, I think, again, conversation. And obviously our action needs to move beyond just dialogue. Dialogue alone does not stop these systems, but here in our communities, we need to educate, and that involves dialogue. Go up, ask them. I think a lot of the time as well, just asking simple questions, bring it right back. I was chatting to some street preachers the other week. Bring it right back. When you say bless Israel, what does that mean? Bless them and dropping bombs on children? What does it mean? Get them to articulate this stuff, because when they have to articulate it, they either have to it all kind of crumbles, or they have to basically say some pretty jarring things, which is that they believe in a God who supports apartheid and displacement and subjugation and murder and genocide. Those things aren't of God.
I have a second question. I saw on social media very recently that a volunteer activist filmed a Palestinian being shot. And I know you hope to go back to Palestine, but what I heard was that the Israeli government has now withdrawn the visas of all volunteer activists from international.
Yeah, that's been going on for a while. So there's volunteers from around the world who come and do what's called protective presence. So they're there with those communities, documenting what's happening, because again, as internationals, say with a New Zealand passport, you face far less threat of death and violence than local Palestinian communities. But yeah, for a long, long time, if Israel find out that that's what people are doing, they bar them. Again, to clarify, in case anyone's watching the live stream, that's not what I'm doing. Let me back in. Anyway, yeah.
Do you think a two-state solution would work? And if not, why not?
Good question. I think whatever, I would swap the word solution for outcome. I think, there are outcomes, but there's no solutions. But whatever that is, it has to come from people on the ground. They're the communities who are having to live it out. They're the communities that are having to enact it. However, when we, again, leaders, whether that's church leaders or elected political leaders, community leaders, harp on about this two-state, one, it ignores the fact that essentially what we've already got kind of is a two-state, and we haven't recognised the Palestinian state during that time, and so it has shrunk, and now we've essentially got one state, which is Israel controlling that whole land. And they're publicly talking about annexing the West Bank, ethnically cleansing all the communities from Gaza. Whether it's two-state, one state, it needs to address the fact that you have millions of refugees who need to return. And if they are returning to their homes and communities in what is now Israel, then Israel isn't going to have its Jewish majority. And so there's no way you can maintain being a democracy, which Israel isn't anyway, but you can't maintain that if you don't have the numbers. And so again, that's why you see these systems forcing Palestinians out of the land, to maintain this Jewish majority, to keep it as a Jewish-only state. So no, I don't think you can have a two-state solution that's fair, and I also don't think that it's sustainable, because you still have Palestinians living in the West Bank whose only experience of Jewish Israelis is the soldiers turning them around at checkpoints or raiding their homes in the night. And so, there's this narrative that Palestinians teach their children to hate Jews in school. I didn't meet a single Palestinian who said that. One, they always clarify, we don't hate Jews, we're very against the Zionist regime. But two, they're taught that at the checkpoints, they're taught that in their homes when soldiers raid it, they're taught that by the Israeli state. So again, until there's a solution or an outcome that addresses the root issues of, the right to return and equality across the land, that's what we're talking about. Jews, Muslims, Christians living with equal rights in the land, until there is an outcome that actually, has that, how can there be peace?
Thanks for a great talk. The first time I ever heard a sympathetic word about Palestine, I was 26 years old. I grew up in the United States. So if you identify as a Christian and you're under 26 years old, you're privileged to be getting this information. And to frame my question, I already know the answer to this, but what would happen if tomorrow the United States ceased funding the Israeli military? What would become of the Israeli state? Thank you.
Thanks, that's a great question. So America are one of the biggest funders of the Israeli military. Without that, they can't continue their military domination of Palestinians, and again, they have to come to the table with genuine intentions to actually seek what is good for everyone in the land instead of just Israelis. So the system would crumble. And so again, the importance of putting pressure on Israel is one thing, but again, our leaders need to actually, have the courage to also speak strongly and act strongly against what America is doing. And I don't hold faith that our current government will do that. We have seen them display clearly that they have no intention of that. But again, they're put in place by the people. We have an election next year, so keep mounting pressure. It's one of the best, most effective things we can do is vote. Yeah.
Time for 2 more questions.
Oh, there's one over here and one over here. Yeah,
Great.
perfect.
We'll come over here first, Mark.
Thanks. I get the repeated message that the Israeli military do not like the video evidence, the truth, getting out. So is there any technological tool that could be put in place, the size of a security camera, just lots of them around the place, sending off video that's unstoppable to a satellite or whatever, so that like the American voting public, for example, see the truth?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's lots of security cameras placed in a lot of these communities. Often the security cameras are the first things vandalised when settlers arrive, again, to hide the evidence. And so Palestinians and activists will film what's happening on their phones. I was really blown away by some of the things that I was able to film with the soldiers right there, and they didn't care, because for many generations, or for many decades, they have been filmed and documented and nothing's changed. They're more worried recently. They start to wear balaclavas for their own personal, they want to be able to travel, and they're aware that sanctions are beginning to take place on individuals, but they're not afraid of it being seen, because, they are and they aren't, because the world still isn't stepping up and actually preventing this stuff. But I had another thought on that, but it's vanished. But yeah, it's important to document this stuff, to share this stuff. Oh yes, it was sharing it with American communities. Unfortunately, there is a wide ignorance, and that's a really big problem. But then unfortunately, a lot of people, even when they see those videos, either just brazenly deny them, or they'll say, yeah, but that's okay. Like a lot of them, again, because of this total dehumanization of Islam and of Arabs, they're completely fine with this stuff happening. Or they say, oh, well, the Palestinian probably started it. Like this kind of stuff, there's a real devaluing of Palestinians' ability to actually narrate their own realities. Even the fact that I'm here sharing tonight instead of a Palestinian sharing their own stories, it makes it more approachable for people. But man, I can't wait for the day when Palestinian voices are trusted and aren't silenced, particularly in faith communities. Yeah. Last question.
Cole, thank you. I feel sick. Well, not sick, but I just feel it's just unhumane. But what I'm seeing in here are males, all right? Many of your pictures of young boys, men, military men. What about the woman and the humanity of the woman? And also, we stood to see your friend, but is there a group of solidarity of Israelites or people that are settlers that would support the Palestine people? They must have some.
Yeah.
Groups.
2 great points there. So Palestinian women are incredible. A lot of the movements only exist and are only able to happen because of Palestinian women working behind the scenes. Often the men are kind of up on the front and the other one's seen, but Palestinian women can speak to it better than I can, but there's examples down in Masafariata, for instance, where they will hold demonstrations to protest against what's happening to their communities, and when the military turn up, the women will actually step out in front and kind of block them from reaching the men, because they're less likely to face the same level of violence, so the men can kind of escape while they stand there. Then of course, you have Palestinian men who are sent to prison for decades, and the women are the ones who hold the community together and keep things going. And we've seen, footage from Gaza of the way that Palestinian women have, again, held communities together there, kept families together, and yeah, that so essential. And your second point was? Yes, groups of people. Yeah, so the question was, are there groups of Israelis who are working alongside Palestinian communities? Yes, there's some incredible organizations, Rabbis for Human Rights, standing together. Some of these groups are very, there's a wide variety where you have some of these groups who are very against, like they're talking about colonization. They're talking about this as a colonial project, which is what it is. The early Zionist leaders used that same language. And so they're talking about, dismantling the very system of what Israel is based on, which is this ethnic supremacy. Then there's groups who talk about the occupation. So they're talking about just the military control of Gaza and the West Bank, but they're not yet kind of unpacking the social the very foundation of Israel as a state was built on the same violence. So the groups who are actively kind of really pushing, some of these activists I've met, there's close friends of mine, and they say there's around maybe 200 to 250 of them. So when we see those massive protests in the streets of Tel Aviv with hundreds and thousands of people protesting against the government, they're protesting against the government because they see the government as kind of taking away their civil rights. Or in regards to the genocide in Gaza, they're protesting against the government because it's dropping bombs, and they quite rightly recognise that they're not going to have their hostages coming back alive if Israel continue bombing in that way. But once the hostages are released, most of them, like, they're not turning up necessarily out of care for what Palestinians are actually facing or for actually confronting these systems. And so you have communities who talk about peace, they're like in the peace camp, but when they talk about peace, they're not talking about deconstructing all of these systems. So they're, again, just talking about kind of submission. Palestinians should stop fighting back against this system. And I mean, we would never, like looking at World War II or the horrors of the Holocaust, which was enacted upon Jews, we would never go to Jews and say, oh, but you have to, what about both sides? We recognise that they were defending themselves from this oppressive, violent regime. And so yes, anyway, to come back, there's fantastic Jewish groups working alongside Palestinian communities on the ground, and it's very important that we support them. And again, they've emphasised the importance of the international community to actually uphold the work that they're doing as well. So, yes.
Cool. Fantastic. Cole, thank you so much. Cole is doing a tour around the country at the moment. You were in Invercargill yesterday?
Yeah.
That is a long drive. So thank you so much for being here. A few final instructions as we go. If you're in one of the white chairs down the back, if you could fold those up and put them over by the sound desk there, that would just give us a bit more space around table for fellowship. That would be wonderful. Please do feel free to stick around, have something to drink, have something to eat. I'm sure Cole will take some questions individually if you'd like to come and chat with him. If you want to or feel a need to respond to what you've seen in prayer, feel free to use the chapel just there. Otherwise, chat amongst, make some new friends and share what you've learnt with one another. So thank you so much, Cole.
And thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to say a final note. If you know others around the country, the dates and locations of each of my talks that are coming up are printed at the back by my mum's, but they're also on the Aotearoa Christians for Peace in Palestine website, ac4pp.com. Please do invite people that you know to come along, particularly Zionists. Let's get them along as well, because it makes a hearty Q&A. So thank you so much for coming.